Hey, Psych 9 students, Professor Zeeb here, and we're going to move on to our next lecture. So I kind of like to do my lectures in different rooms in my house, and I'm actually doing this lecture from my wife's office, which actually used to be my daughter's bedroom, and that's why it is pink in the background, if you're wondering that, which I have to say, it looks really bizarre with the lighting. I don't know, it looks kind of strange. Anyway, if you're wondering why I have a pink background, that is why. So what we're going to talk about this time is doing research. So we're going to kind of switch gears and go into the research component of the class, which really sets up how we gather data in the field of psychology and development and so forth. Okay, so let's get to our slides here, and then we'll kind of kick it off and talk about some different research designs. Okay, developmental research, here we go. So first of all, we have to say that the goal of research is to collect what we call valid and reliable data, which sounds very nerdy and technical, but it's also a very important point. So valid, what we mean by valid data is that it's genuine. We want our data to be real. We want it to be right. We don't want it to be false. I mean, that's pretty obvious, right? We don't want to collect data that's a bunch of BS that doesn't make sense. We want it to actually be valid. We also want our data to be what we call reliable. Reliable meaning consistent. In other words, we want our data to not only be right, but also to be able to be predictive, to allow us to sort of say, okay, this is probably what's going on and what's going to happen. So reliable means consistency. We want it consistent from measurement to measurement. In other words, we don't want it all over the place because that would not do us any good. We want it to be genuine and valid. We want it to be reliable and consistent, and that's really one of our major goals, okay? So when we conduct research in science, of course, psychology is considered a science because we do use the scientific method. We definitely use different research designs. So a researcher has several tools in their belt, so to speak, that they can draw from. Now, keep in mind that some of these designs, or actually all of them, I should say, have pros and cons. I mean, none of them are perfect. Some of them are a little bit more appropriate in certain situations. So as a researcher, I have to know which one to go with and which one would be probably the best one. So keep in mind as we go through these guys that they do have strengths and weaknesses. We're going to introduce a couple here in this particular lecture. Okay, I'm not going to throw them all out at you at this particular lecture, but we'll cover a few here. All right, so let's go to our next slide here. So we're going to talk about something called descriptive studies. Descriptive studies basically mean that they're numerically descriptive. We're going to describe something without necessarily manipulating our subjects. And you'll see what I mean as we progress through the course with that particular comment. So in other words, we're going to use statistics, for example, to analyze behavior and developmental concepts. You know, it could consist of creating averages for something. Let's say we want to know how much screen time kids are getting on average. I mean, you know, it seems like wherever you go, you see kids on cell phones and tablets. You know, it seems like they're everywhere. So how much per day are kids actually using their devices? We would use this type of design to kind of figure that out. All right. So in other words, these types of designs count things. They observe the frequency of something to kind of get some data that we can analyze and look at. All right, let's look at some different strategies here. One of our most popular and probably one of the most easiest ones to do is something called a self-report. And it is just that. This is where the data is, the subjects, provide their own data. That's why we call it self-report. So an example of this would be like an interview or some type of survey where we're asking our subjects questions and they provide the answer. I mean, some of you have probably, in fact, all of you have probably taken some type of online survey at one point. The great thing about these is that they're very inexpensive. They're very quick once you get your measure designed. So once I gather my questions and put them in a questionnaire, I can easily give them to people and I get my data back very, very quickly. So it's very efficient in terms of that. The problem is with these is that there's no guarantee that people are telling the truth. In fact, they could be completely lying. You have no idea if this is actually genuine data, which we said is one of the goals of research. For example, if we ask people, have you ever used your cell phone while driving your car? A lot of people will say, oh, no, I never do that, because obviously it's illegal. But let's face it, people do that all the time and may not want to admit it. So when we're asking questions about touchy, sensitive, areas, and you can use your imagination what those would be, we're not always guaranteed the truth, and therefore you have to kind of take it with a grain of salt, if you would, as a researcher. So it's a little bit loose in terms of the validity because of that. We could do observational studies. These are often done with children. They're done in development a lot. The name says it all. Basically, we're observing some type of behavior, for example, and maybe we're counting how many times it happens. So we're actually observing our subjects rather than directly asking them a question. For example, let's say we're interested in social interaction on the playground. So we, as a researcher, we get the school's permission to go to the school. We observe children at recess, and we simply count how many times they initiate a social contact with other kids on the playground to get an estimate of how much it's actually happening. The point is, we're observing people in action to collect our data. Well, the problem with this one is that when people know they're being watched, we have to tell them. We would have to get parental permission. We would have to tell them that we're watching them. We can't spy on people is the point. When people know they're being watched, they may act very differently than they normally would when people are not. The classic example, what I sort of think about with this one, is that how many people actually stop at a stop sign? So if there was no cameras and no one around, there was not a police officer there, I think a lot of people kind of blow through stop signs, or they don't stop all the way. They do the California stop kind of thing, right? I know I'm guilty of that sometimes. But if I was out on the corner with a camera recording it, if I got the city's permission to do that, I think, that may change things. Or if I put on a police uniform, for example, and watch people, we may see some very different behavior. So the simple fact that subjects may know they're being watched during a study, they may act very differently than they normally would. Sometimes we call that the halo effect, where people are, acting on their best behavior because they know they're being observed is kind of the point. All right, so next we go to something called a case study. This one's a little bit more difficult to understand, but let's kind of look at this. A case study, as the slides say here, an in-depth study involving an in-depth description and analysis of a single person or group. So that's quite a description there. But basically the point is the focus of the study is on a single person or a single group. Rather than getting a random sample of 1,000 people where we submit a survey for them to answer, this is more focused on one person or one group, okay? And notice it's very in-depth. So in this particular case, we would not just measure them once, we would interview them, we would observe them, we would get lots and lots of data. So this particular design is great because it gives us a lot of rich data. It may take months to conduct a study like this, where we said the self-report could be done very quickly, right? So this one's more in depth. We're going to get a lot of data. I guess the drawback is that it would take longer, but the data is going to be very rich. But the problem here, one of the major problems with the case study, is that it's very biased because we're often focused on one person or one group. We're not looking at the average of random people. You guys see that point? Really, we only would do this design if we're kind of forced into it. Like if there's some kind of rare disease on the planet and 3 people on the planet have this disease and we want to study it and know about it, we can't get a random sample of 1,000 people, obviously. So we would have to go to each person and study them in depth to really gain as much information that we can to learn about it, because we're kind of forced into that. So the great thing about this one is that it's going to give us a lot of good data. We're going to get lots of rich data about that person or group. However, the drawback is that we can't generalize the findings to other people very well because it's so focused on one person. Do you guys understand that? In other words, the person we're focusing on, they may have a certain personality or a certain culture, or something makes them very unique that it's hard to apply that data to other people in the future because it only applies to them, if that makes sense. In research, we would say that has generalizability issues. See, with self-report, that's not a problem because we're measuring several people and all those differences are sort of ironed out through averages. So it's a good study, it's a good technique because we get lots of good data, but it's very specific to that one subject or one group, which can be very, very limiting. So that's kind of the problem. All right, so that will kind of conclude this particular short lecture. I want you to progress in Canvas and go to the next steps to learn about some of our other experiments or other research designs that we employ in development. And the next ones are a little bit more powerful and more widely used. So they're very important. So make sure you check those out. All right. Thanks, guys, for listening. We will see you online.